I've always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and tales of the supernatural were just that to me, stories. But Espantosa Lake, that place, it's different. The first time I heard about it, I was visiting a small Texas town for work. My host, an old rancher with leathery skin and a quiet demeanor, told me about the lake over a dinner of cornbread and chili. He said the name Espantosa wasn't just for show. It meant horrifying in Spanish, and it was well earned. According to him, Espantosa Lake was shrouded in a near-constant fog at night, so thick you could lose sight of your own hand in front of your face. The water, black as tar, reflected nothing, even on the brightest nights. "It's not just a lake," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a place where things go to disappear." The locals told of eerie howls that echoed through the night, louder and closer than any wolf should dare come. They spoke of livestock vanishing without a trace, the ground around their pens undisturbed. And then there were the shadows, twisted, elongated shapes that moved just beyond the edge of the fog. I laughed it off at the time, but his expression stayed with me. He wasn't joking, and the quiet fear in his eyes unsettled me more than I cared to admit. What intrigued me most was the legend of the she-wolf. The rancher claimed it was more than a campfire story, that it dated back to the 1800s when settlers first arrived in the area. He said she was a woman, or at least something that looked like one, who lived among wolves. She hunted with them, howled with them, and according to some, she even led them. They say she wasn't human, he told me, his voice low and gravelly. Not entirely. She was a spirit, a curse, or maybe just the devil himself. As he spoke, the air seemed heavier, as if the weight of the lake's history was pressing down on us. He told me how people avoided the area, how even the bravest cowboys wouldn't ride through the fog. "It's not just a place," he said again, his eyes locking onto mine. "It's a warning." I didn't believe him. Not then, at least. But the way his voice lingered in my mind long after we parted made me question myself. Something about Espantosa Lake was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that the stories, as wild as they sounded, might hold a sliver of truth. I told myself it was curiosity that drove me to the lake that night. Maybe it was boredom or the need to prove the rancher wrong. But deep down, I think it was something more, a pull, like the lake itself was calling me. The road leading to Espantosa Lake was long and desolate, flanked by dry scrub and the occasional gnarled tree. The moon was a faint sliver in the sky, casting just enough light to make the landscape look even more sinister. My headlights barely pierced the dense fog that began creeping across the dirt path as I got closer. The stories about the fog weren't exaggerated. It moved unnaturally, swirling around my truck like it had a mind of its own. I rolled the window down slightly to get a better look, and the air hit me like a slap, cold, damp, and carrying a faint metallic tang that reminded me of blood. I pulled up to the lake's edge and killed the engine. The silence was immediate and suffocating. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the soft lapping of water against the shore. I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel, and shone my flashlight toward the lake. The water was as black as the rancher had described, an endless void that swallowed the beam of my light. The fog hovered above it, thick and unmoving, like a shroud. It was unsettling, but nothing compared to what happened next. As I stood there, debating whether this was all a big mistake, I heard it. A howl. It wasn't a regular wolf's howl. It was deeper, more guttural, and it echoed in a way that made my stomach churn. It didn't come from one direction. It seemed to rise from everywhere at once. My hand instinctively went to the knife on my belt, though I doubted it would do much good against whatever was out there. I scanned the tree line, the flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. That's when I saw movement. A shadow, low to the ground and impossibly fast, darted between the trees. Then another, and another. Panic set in, but I forced myself to stay still. The shadows didn't come closer. They seemed to circle me, just at the edge of the fog. And then, through the haze, I saw her. A figure emerged from the fog, moving with an eerie, unnatural grace. She was tall and thin, her pale skin almost glowing in the dim light. Her hair was long and matted, hanging in dark strands over her face. She wore tattered clothing that clung to her frame, but her movements were more animal than human. Her eyes caught the light of my flashlight, and they gleamed like a predator's, yellow, piercing, and utterly devoid of humanity. She stood there, staring at me, unblinking. Around her, the shadows grew thicker, and I realized they weren't just shapes. They were wolves, their eyes glowing faintly in the fog. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And then, without a sound, she tilted her head back and howled. It was a sound that seemed to rip through my very soul, primal and haunting. The wolves joined in, their howls blending into a cacophony that made the ground beneath my feet tremble. And just like that, she vanished, slipping back into the fog as quickly as she had appeared. The wolves followed, their glowing eyes disappearing one by one until there was nothing but the oppressive silence. Once more, I stumbled back to my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys into the ignition. As I drove away, I didn't look back, but I could still hear the howls echoing in the distance, growing fainter with every mile. I didn't sleep that night, even after I made it back home, locking the door behind me and turning on every light in the house. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes on me, yellow and unblinking, piercing through the fog and into my soul. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. The fog, the wolves, the woman, just an elaborate trick of the mind, fueled by the rancher's story and my own overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I avoided the lake. I told myself I had work to do, errands to run, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the pull was still there, gnawing at the back of my thoughts. By evening, I couldn't fight it anymore. I needed to know the truth. This time, I didn't take the truck. I wanted to approach on foot, silently, hoping to catch a glimpse of her, or whatever she was, without drawing attention. The sun was just beginning to set as I made my way through the scrubland, the shadows growing longer with every step. The air grew colder the closer I got, and that same metallic tang returned, stronger now, almost overpowering. I reached the edge of the lake and crouched behind a cluster of rocks, my heart pounding in my chest. The fog was already there, rolling across the water in thick, ghostly tendrils. For a long time, there was nothing, just the sound of the water and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. And then I heard it, a low growl, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. I froze, gripping the handle of my knife, though I knew it was useless against whatever was out there. The growling grew louder, closer, and I realized it wasn't coming from one direction. It surrounded me, echoing off the rocks and trees. I stood slowly, scanning the fog, and that's when I saw her again. She emerged from the water this time, her movements fluid and inhuman. Her hair was slicked back, revealing a face that was both beautiful and terrifying. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. She didn't seem to notice me at first. She knelt by the water's edge, her hands clawing into the mud, as if searching for something. The growling continued, and I realized it was coming from her, low, guttural, and unlike anything I'd ever heard from a human. I stepped back, and my foot snapped a twig. Her head snapped up instantly, her eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, she let out a snarl, baring teeth that were too sharp, too animalistic. The wolves appeared next, materializing from the fog like ghosts. They surrounded her, their eyes glowing the same eerie yellow as hers. They didn't move toward me. Not yet. They just stood there, watching, waiting. She rose to her feet, her movements impossibly graceful, and took a step toward me. I didn't mean any harm, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't comforting. It was predatory. Before I could react, she let out a howl that shook the air around me. The wolves responded instantly, their howls blending with hers in a chilling symphony that made my blood run cold. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the scrubland, where the fog finally thinned, and the growls faded into silence. But I knew this wasn't over. I barely slept after that encounter. My mind replayed every detail. Her glowing eyes, her inhuman movements, the wolves that seemed to obey her every command. By morning, I was consumed by the need for answers. I started with the rancher. He greeted me with his usual wariness. But when I asked about the she-wolf, his expression darkened. "I told you to stay away from the lake," he said, slamming his mug of coffee on the table. "People who go looking for her don't come back." I told him what I'd seen, leaving out the part where I nearly got caught. His weathered face grew paler with every word. "You're not the first to see her," he admitted. "She's been here as long as anyone can remember. My grandfather used to say she was cursed, a woman who betrayed her people, condemned to wander the lake forever." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But the wolves, they say she's more than cursed. She's part of them now. Or maybe they're part of her. Either way, she's not human anymore." I left his house with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. I wasn't dealing with an ordinary haunting. That night, I returned to the lake, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my growing obsession. The fog was heavier than ever, wrapping around me like a shroud. I kept my footsteps light, my breathing shallow, and approached the water's edge with as much caution as I could muster. This time, I saw them before I heard them. The wolves stood in a perfect circle around her, their glowing eyes reflecting in the water. She was kneeling again, her hands submerged in the lake. But as I watched, something changed. The water began to ripple, though there was no wind. The ripples grew stronger, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. She moved her hands in slow, deliberate motions, as if commanding the lake itself. Then I saw them, shapes beneath the water. Faces, distorted and pale, pressed against the surface as though trying to break free. They stared up at her, their mouths open in silent screams. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and landing with a thud. The noise broke her concentration. Her head snapped up, and once again, her eyes locked onto mine. This time, she didn't smile. She rose slowly, her movements unnervingly calm, and began to walk toward me. The wolves followed, their growls low and threatening. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the air itself had turned solid, holding me in place. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice low and guttural, yet undeniably human. She raised a hand, and the air grew colder. The shapes in the water became clearer, their expressions more desperate. I realized, with a sinking horror, that they weren't just faces. They were people, her victims, trapped beneath the surface. "Please," I managed to whisper. I didn't mean any harm. Her lips twitched, almost like a smirk. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, she turned and disappeared into the fog, the wolves following close behind. The air loosened its grip on me, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. When I finally looked up, the lake was still again, the fog retreating as if it had never been there. But the shapes beneath the water were gone, leaving only ripples behind. I knew I'd been spared for now. I didn't wait to catch my breath. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding, and stumbled away from the lake. My flashlight was gone, swallowed by the darkness. But I didn't dare go back for it. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound an echo of pursuit. The path I'd taken earlier was nowhere to be found. The fog thickened, curling around the trees and swallowing the landscape. I could barely see my hands in front of me, let alone the way out. Panic set in, a gnawing, primal fear that gripped my chest. I forced myself to focus, to keep moving. The wolves' growls echoed in the distance, low and menacing. They weren't far behind. The ground beneath me turned soft, muddy, pulling at my boots with every step. My movements grew slower, more labored. I could feel the lake's suppressive energy dragging me back, as if it didn't want to let me go. Then I heard her voice. "You can't leave." It wasn't loud, but it echoed all around me, filling my ears like a whisper carried by the wind. I froze, turning in circles, but there was no sign of her, just the fog and the shadows. "You've seen too much." The voice was closer now, chillingly calm. I didn't wait to hear more. I broke into a desperate run, lungs burning, legs screaming with effort. Ahead, I saw a break in the fog, a faint glimmer of light. Hope surged in my chest, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the branches that tore at my skin and the roots that threatened to trip me. Behind me, the growls grew louder, closer. I could hear the snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves. The wolves were closing in. I burst through the tree line and onto solid ground. A road. My car was just ahead, parked where I'd left it. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling so badly that I dropped them twice before finally unlocking the door. I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking fingers. The growls stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. I glanced out the window, my breath fogging the glass. The wolves were nowhere to be seen. The fog was thinning, retreating back toward the lake. But then I saw her. She stood at the edge of the tree line, her glowing eyes fixed on me. Her expression was unreadable, neither anger nor triumph, but something deeper, something ancient. She raised a hand, and for a moment, I thought she was about to come after me. But instead, she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was a warning. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I started the engine and tore down the road, not daring to look back. Even now, safe in my home, far from Espantosa Lake, her eyes haunt me. That smile lingers in my mind, a promise of something I can't quite understand. I don't know what she is. I don't know why she let me go. But I know one thing for certain. I'll never go back. And if you're ever near Espantosa Lake, do yourself a favor. Stay away.